My supervisor says I'm using the wrong analysis. How do I know which statistics test to use and what will actually fit my research question? So Matthew, how do we know what research statistical tests to use? It's chaos out there, so we'd appreciate some insight.
It certainly is chaos out there because there are hundreds of variations of the statistical tests that we can choose from. So it can be legitimately very hard. My first piece of advice here is I want you to go back to whatever your statistics course looked like in your program. You likely had one, if not two or three stats courses through your program. I want you to go back to your notes and syllabi there, and I want you to see or remind yourself what tests did we learn in that context. That's where I want you to start. Why? Because I want you to narrow down the volume of options into something that's a little more tangible and to a set of tests that you have already learned how to deploy. So we're not spending hours and hours and hours learning new methods. Once we've done that, that kind of narrows our list. That helps. Then I want you to think about your research question itself and what are you really trying to accomplish through your research question. So maybe you are describing the current state of a situation or a group. Then you're going to be using your standard descriptive statistics and percentages and frequencies to help describe that group. Maybe you are comparing two or more groups, and then we're going to be using a t-test variation, an ANOVA variation, maybe some post hoc ANOVA test, like a two-key post hoc test to help us understand those groups. We might be looking at relationships between variables, and then we're going to pull out our correlation skills and we're going to pick a correlation model. Maybe you're trying to predict what's going to come next. So we might be looking at regression models. And so, really thinking about your research question, what is it you're hoping to accomplish? And then, how do we pick the right test? Again, one that we've already learned about, one that's already sort of been taught and approved by our institution. How do we pick the right test to answer that question?
So following up from that, Matthew, how do we know what is the appropriate test? Do tests do different things? Tell us more about sort of what are the base ideas that we have to be answering or questions.
Yeah, so different tests do different things, and that's a really important nuance. And unfortunately, I find both in my own graduate instruction and with my clients that we don't do a very good job teaching what the different tests actually do. We teach kind of how to do it and what buttons to click, but that can be a persistent challenge for a lot of us. And so we want to think about things like t-tests, for example. That's a very common test. I see that in a lot of dissertations. A t-test compares the average of two groups. So if I've got a group A and a group B, and I want to see which group maybe outperformed, or if those two groups performed in a statistically different way, then a t-test might be an appropriate choice. And ANOVA is a similar test, but it runs on multiple groups. So instead of two groups, I might have three, four, five groups. That's going to help me know, is there difference among the groups? And then I'm going to run some post hoc tests to figure out where that difference is. Regression analysis, that helps us to make predictions by kind of taking historical data and sort of drawing a straight line through it so we can figure out where do we go from here. We might, maybe if we have a question about goal setting, for example, or about, I see a lot of this with my clients who are working in industry and they're trying to predict future profit margins, things like that. Regression might be a great test there. And then you think about correlation, that's the last one I'll kind of throw out here, relationships between two things. So people who had this experience also had this outcome. This experience didn't necessarily cause that outcome. That's an important nuance. You've all heard that phrase, correlation does not equal causation. I feel like every time you say that, a statistician gets their wings or something. There's a metaphor in there somewhere, a catchy phrase, but it's all about relationship, right? So anytime we need to look at relationships, correlation is a great test to look at.
Thanks, Matthew. That's really helpful. The only other bit I'll add is different tests require different types of data as well. So think about your data. Is it a continuous variable? Is it categorical? Because different tests require different data types. You might need a continuous predictive variable and then a categorical grouping variable. for a t-test or something like that. But again, if you are feeling lost, feeling uncertain, there are a wealth of resources out there. I know I specifically use, I think it's UCLA's cheat sheet, which is available online, freely accessible. And that's a great way to say, okay, what type of data do I have? What is my question? And where do I go from there? So sticking with the statistical side, Mustafa asked us, how do I interpret a p-value in plain English without overselling what my data shows or getting confused? So Matthew, what's a p-value? Why do we use it? And how do we explain it without confusing everyone?
Yeah, here's the $1,000,000 question, right? Man, we're starting strong today. So, p value, this is something that really throws a lot of graduate students. And I'm going to also say a lot of working professionals. There's a great article, you can Google and find this. 538 put out an article several years ago where they went to a stats conference and they asked statisticians to define a p value. They didn't get the same answer twice, and several people said, I don't really know. So if you're in that boat and you're feeling like, gosh, I don't really know what this means, you're in good company because it's one of those things that is just very esoteric. So, what is the p value? Putting it in plain language, p value helps us to understand how likely it is that the difference between two groups is due to random chance or due to whatever intervention may have been introduced into that mix. Intervention, difference, category, it could be a lot of things, right? So we have this sort of arbitrary number of 0.05, which is about 5%. So we say, there's a 5% chance that this is due to just luck, just happenstance. Again, that is an arbitrary number. There are literally whole books written about the history of p-value that discuss kind of how the origins of that threshold came to be, but that is sort of the established value, and we're just going to go with it. We're not going to think too hard about it because it is a pretty arbitrary value. And then we also see that 0.001 or 0.1 and 0.001 as being sort of, again, your benchmarks of statistical significance. So if our p-value is below those measures, we say that the results are significantly different. So again, we're just trying to demonstrate that there is a difference. So we might look at the average, for example, of two groups so we can see with our eyes, there's a clear difference here. These numbers are different. The p-value helps us understand what is the likelihood that that difference is due to chance versus the actual intervention or situation we were in.
Nice, Matthew. I think you've done proud statisticians. I'm hiding my wings at the moment. Just to follow up on that question, what do you think is the best way to present your results? Let's say we got that significant p-value. What do we need to say about that? Do we just say it's significant and carry on our way, or is there anything else that we need to be aware of?
So I think it's important that we consider both the statistical significance and practical significance of our results. My work as a professional is in the K-12 education space. And so I often will use examples in that setting. Something can be statistically significant, but the actual change or difference between groups can be very small. And so we want to be able to kind of apply that practical significance. Measures like effect size can be a great way for us to do that, to put that p-value in a little context. Again, I said earlier, there's whole books written about p-value and its history and the questions and the problems. There's also a pretty big movement in the statistics world to shift towards practical significance and kind of downplay that statistical significance a little. So anytime that we can wrap that p-value in some context with some other statistics like effect size is a good one. You can use a correlation to do that as well. That's going to help that p-value make a little more sense to your reader, give you a little more credibility too.
I think that's a great point. We also see it a lot in the medical field as well, where there is statistical significance, but the change in the incidence rate for a disease is absolutely minuscule. And so it's not a practical improvement. So let's go on to a question submitted by Darren. And this is one I personally experienced as well with one of my master's thesis chapters. What happens if my results aren't statistically significant? Have I failed? is it the end of the world? So, Matthew, what do we do when we don't get a significant p value?
Yeah, man, that can really feel like a punch in the gut when you've done a study and you've done your analysis and you find that it's not statistically significant. I've also had that experience as well as a practicing researcher, and many of my clients have as well. But here's what I'm going to say about that: it does not mean that you've failed, okay? Because your job in writing a dissertation and being a researcher is to create new knowledge that is now out in the world for people to learn from and grow from, right? And can we just pause for a minute and reflect on how awesome is that? Like, there is new knowledge that didn't exist before that now, because you've done work, there is new knowledge out in the world and people can take that and build on it. That's so cool. And so, even if your results are not statistically significant, they might still be practically significant. And that's something we can talk about. But also, we can talk about how they are not statistically significant and what that means for our field, for the industry, for the world. That is so important. We talk a lot about publication bias in our field and research world, where we just pocket things. We go, oh, that wasn't significant. We throw it in the trash. Well, every time you do that, someone else is going to rerun that study and then they're going to throw it in the trash. And that might happen 20 times. And that's 20 studies that could have just been not ever done. We could have done more productive things if that first one had been published. So be proud of your work, be proud of the new knowledge that you have created, and accept what those results are and move forward with it.
I think, not to add anything in terms of further questions, but just an example as well. My wife did her master's. She got a non-significant result. None of her tests were significant, but she got a distinction for her master's. And the reason being is that she engaged critically with why those results were insignificant. What did that mean? What were the outcomes? What was the potential reasons? So getting a non-significant result is not the end of the world. It's not what we expected, for sure. But then it becomes our goal as a researcher to figure out why that's the case and how we can present that. So just to give you a little bit of joy there, Darren, if you don't have a significant result, it's not the end of the world. It's not the end of your PhD. And there's still a chance for that distinction as well. So Miriam asked, what are the key steps needed for a quantitative analysis from data collection to write-up? Now, this is a big question, Matthew. So maybe we can just go into what are the key steps that we can follow just to make sure we're getting all of the basics together.
Yeah. So this is a great opportunity to have this kind of conversation with a coach at Grad Coach who can really look at your work and walk you through step by step what you need to do for your specific study. But in general, we're going to follow a couple of steps. We're going to start by really taking the data that we've collected and cleaning that up. We're going to prepare that data set for analysis. We're going to handle our missing values, our duplicate cases, all of those things that pop up when we do a quantitative study. We're going to start with our descriptive statistics. This allows us to just sort of play in the data. I always think of descriptive statistics as like sandbox mode for data analysis. We're just kind of playing and getting our hands dirty, feeling what that data's got to tell us. We might check some different assumptions. We might look at normality. We might look at variance. And we're going to check all of those assumptions. We're going to make sure that we know how those assumptions will feed into the test that we've chosen to run. Then we're going to run our statistical analysis. However, we said we were going to do that in our research proposal. We might have to deviate from that now that we have some real data in front of us, but we're going to do that analysis. We're then going to put those into context. So we're going to take our analysis, we're going to make all of our little charts and tables and all of that. That's an important step. But then we're going to explain what those charts and tables say. And that's really that chapter 4 of your dissertation is all about explaining what this data means. So we're putting it in context, we're explaining. We're not explaining why it matters yet. We do that in chapter 5. In chapter 4, we explain this is what it means. So we clean, we explore, we do our inferential statistics, then we interpret it, put it in some plain language. That gets us to our chapter.
I think that's really helpful, Matthew. Definitely don't forget to make some graphs as well. I always tell my clients, Graphs help. If you're doing statistical data, find a nice way to present that data. It's a little difficult with some tests, but it really makes a difference in presenting the results, even to just help make it obvious the pattern that you're detecting as well. So we've got a question from Tracy, and Tracy asks, what is the best platform to code qualitative data when using a spreadsheet? Now, I'm going to take some latitude here and say, really, do you have any suggestions for qualitative analysis software, Matthew? And if so, why?
Yeah, so this is a good one because when you're dealing with qualitative analysis, it can be a very lengthy process. There can be a lot of stuff, a lot of thinking. Here's what I usually tell my clients about qualitative analysis software. If you are working with a very large volume, so maybe you're doing, I had a client once who had over 200 newspaper articles that was part of their corpus, or you're doing 50 or more hour-long interviews and you've got a large corpus, that's when we want to start looking and thinking about software. Also, if you think that you're going to be doing qualitative research well into the future, right? Like that's going to be part of your job after you finish your doctorate. That's when we want to look at qualitative software packages. Why do I say that? Because at that point, we need all the extra tools and supports that are going to help us get across the finish line. If we're going to do this one study, we have 5, maybe 10, 30-minute interviews that we're going to be working with. Then I usually tell people to do this by hand in a spreadsheet because in my view, it's not worth the time and money to learn a software if you're never going to use it again. And if you don't really need all those extra tools. If you've got a small corpus and you don't need all the extra tools, doing it by hand can be very simple. We have a great video on the Grad Coach YouTube channel about how to do this in a spreadsheet. I use that with a lot of clients. They have a lot of success with that. So I definitely recommend checking that out. If you don't want to use a spreadsheet and you really do want to look at a software, maybe you are using a large corpus, maybe you do intend to do this, the two that I like most are NVivo and Deduce. They both more or less work the same. You're going to upload your transcripts from your interviews, or you're going to upload your newspaper articles, or whatever your qualitative source is. And you're going to read through, you're going to kind of highlight words, right click, add a code. And it's going to keep all of your codes nice and orderly. It's going to allow you to repeat codes. It's going to help create frequency tables and all of that stuff that we would be doing exactly the same process in a spreadsheet. It just does it a little more streamlined for a large volume.
So Alice says, if I have 100 plus codes, how do I simplify my qualitative analysis without losing meaning? So what do I do when I have too many codes, Matthew?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think 100 plus codes generally is probably too many. Now, if you have a huge corpus, I don't know. I can't see your data, so it might be appropriate for you. But generally, I'm going to say that's probably too many. So here's how I want you to think about that. First, I want you to go back and look at your codes themselves. So, not so much at the actual text. Let's focus on these codes and let's look at similarities around codes first. So, it could be very common, it is very common that you have two codes that are very similar and they really could be the same code. But because it was 5 days between when you wrote the first code versus the second code, you get kind of lost in that. So I always tell my clients to do sort of a second sweep where we're just looking at the codes and making sure, does this really say what I want it to say? Also, check for things like plurality. So you might have customer, customers as two different codes, but really that's the same code, right? And so we could go back and clean some of that up. That gets your code number down. I call that code cleaning. We're gonna clean those codes. We're gonna do that no matter what. Even if we don't have 100, we're still gonna clean those codes. Then what we could do is we can kind of think about an intermediary space between our themes and our codes. So we can tier them a little bit. So can you create a category under your theme that maybe nests some of those codes together? And then what you do when you go to do your writing, that category is really the code that you write about. And those other little subcategories, those other codes become sort of the nuance that you write about when you go to put it in. So you don't lose that nuance, you just maybe don't name it, right? So our big theme might be elementary school teachers, and then our code might be they're tired, they're hungry, they don't have enough planning time. And so I might actually write about burnout. And those three codes underneath, maybe those were my initial codes, but they're all part of the category of burnout. And that's where I get my nuance.
The other thing that I will add is it is possible as well that you have codes that are not adding to your answering your research question. It's very common. We get caught up in the coding process, and it's nice to see all of those ideas that come out. But if they don't relate back to your research question, don't necessarily throw them away, but just mark them as unnecessary for this project. You can always come back and analyze that in a different way. But just remember, not everything has to be coded. Not everything someone says in an interview is going to be addressing your research questions. We've got a few people asking about the qualitative analysis process in the chat. What would you say are the key stages of qualitative analysis, Matthew?
So, thinking very broadly about qualitative work, of course, first we have our data collection. That's when we do our interviews. And let's just use interviews as an example. We could go down a lot of rabbit holes with different kinds of data, but I think interviews is what most of us are probably doing. So we're going to get our interviews together. We're going to do those in a way where they're recorded, so we can turn that recording into a transcript. That way we can get exact quotes. The next phase is we're going to clean those transcripts. We're going to read them top to bottom. We're going to make sure that everything makes sense. Then we might engage in a member checking activity. We're going to send that transcript back to our interviewee and say, hey, will you look over this? Is this all what you meant to say? Did the software translate this correctly? So that's a really important step that helps just make sure everything is right. Then we're going to take our transcript, we're going to put it into some kind of tool, whether that's a spreadsheet, whether that's Deduce or one of the other software packages to allow us to code. We're going to go through and we're going to apply our codes to the different comments that were made in that transcript. Again, a great video on our YouTube channel on how to do that. We're going to then clean those codes, identify big themes. And then when we go to write, those themes become our subheadings and those codes get discussed underneath those subheadings as we build our chapter 4.
The only thing I would add there as well is make sure to pick out some valid quotes that fit your codes or themes as well. So while you're analyzing that data, while you're picking out those codes, it's really helpful to say, this one really represents this idea well. Make a note of that so that you can come back and quote that person in your analysis chapter, because you want to have data supporting your qualitative findings as well. So Nathan submitted a question and he was wondering, how do we know if our themes are strong enough or if we're just making random categories? Matthew, do you have any suggestions on how to feel confident about your themes?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts here. First, I would say that the qualitative analysis process is very intuitive. And so there is a certain level of sort of gut checking. Does this all really align and does this all make sense? It's up to you as a researcher to then defend that to others, right? That's why we call it a defense at the end of our dissertation, because we're going to defend why we picked those codes in those categories. So there is a little bit of just sort of intuition, a little bit of professionalism and discretion that goes into that process. Feeling uncertain about that, I think, is normal, especially as we're going through the dissertation process, because that imposter syndrome, that little voice comes in and says, you're not good enough, you're not ready to do this. And it's important that we just push that aside and plow forward. In addition to that, as you're doing your categories, you need to be checking those every time you open it against your research questions and make sure that these categories align not just to the text that you've analyzed, but to the questions you're trying to answer. And that mismatch does happen from time to time. We get so into our codes that we forget that our codes are supposed to answer a question. So making sure that there's a clear line between your category and your research question is really important. That's how you're going to defend that category at the end.
I think that's really helpful because it is really difficult. Qualitative analysis, by definition, is somewhat subjective. And so it can be quite overwhelming when you're like, is this what it's saying? Can I trust this? I think importantly, also keep in mind, is this what multiple participants are saying? Sometimes it can be a unique, specific opinion that is really interesting and worth engaging. But if you're worried about your theme, if it's only come up once, one code, one time, maybe that's not a very strong theme. But if you find people saying very similar ideas, that really gives you the confidence behind your codes as well. As a follow up, Matthew, what would you say is the biggest risk or red flag you see when it comes to assigning themes?
So for me, the biggest red flag is when I ask my client, where did this theme come from? And they can't clearly articulate that for me. That to me is a big red flag. That shows a lack of critical thought, a lack of critical engagement with the data. It also makes me wonder if they've pumped this into an AI tool and it's just spit some themes out for them. And even if you do that, you need to be able to defend that theme and connect it back to your data, connect it back to your research question. So that is my number one red flag. When I ask that question and a client can't respond, we're stopping the session. We got to fix this problem before we move on.
Kate asks, should I wait until I have all my interviews completed before starting to code, or can I start when I have the majority of them? There's more to the question, but we'll start with that, Matthew.
Yeah. So this is a little subjective, as kind of all things in qualitative land are. Generally, my advice is to finish all of the interviews before you start coding. And the reason I say that is because codes can sometimes seep into other interviews down the road. And so you kind of start to bias yourself. The caveat to that might be that if you have a really strict deadline with your university and you know that you can't get to these last two people for 2 months, you might go ahead and start. In that instance, you need to have a very strict interview protocol so that you are following that same interview protocol and you're not allowing those codes to come in and bias. So we move from a semi-structured to a structured interview where we're not asking follow-up questions anymore. We're sticking to the script. That way, every interview is the same. It's all about bias reduction for me at that point. But I generally think it's best if you can finish all of them and then sit down and code.
I'm totally in agreement with Matthew there. You really want to not let the interviews, the responses you've received affect how you engage with them. But also from a purely coding perspective, it's tough, it's time consuming, it's frustrating, but it's really beneficial to do your coding in one fell swoop. You want to sit down, get it done in one go. You don't want to come back to it 2 months later because then you're not going to remember why you coded things the way you did, unless you've got a really good notebook. But also, your thinking is going to have shifted in those 2 months. And so that's going to introduce bias. Omar asked, is it okay to remove outliers from my data set? And how do I explain it without it looking like I'm fixing the results?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yes, we can remove outliers, but we want to do so in a standardized, universally accepted way. And so, the way I usually tell my students to do it is using the two key outlier test. That feels to me to be like a very accessible test, as well as being established and common, and it's in like half of these books back here. So it's one that you can cite and feel safe using. Basically, what we're going to do in that test is we're going to take the interquartile range, multiply that by 1.5, 1.5, and then we're going to take the third quartile, go 1.5, and then anything above that is an outlier. Tons of videos on that, tons of written instructions on how to do that. You can Google that and find that formula very easily. But That's the key. So we're not going to just say, I think this is an outlier and kick it out. We need to mathematically determine that it's an outlier using a standardized method like the two key outlier test, and then cite and defend that in our writing.
I think that is exactly right. You need to cite it. You need to explain why you did it, what you did. And then most importantly, you have to indicate that you removed outliers as well. I think it's very easy for when you're data cleaning to just say, oh, I'll remove those two outliers. But if you don't mention that or clearly convey that, that introduces uncertainty about your data. So be clear, be explicit, and use known ways of removing outliers. That might differ in your field as well. So do take a look at the norms in your field. But I think what Matthew has suggested is perfect. Sia's asked a question here. In qualitative research, is it important to ask your participants the same question? Is there a danger of changing your questions as you go?
Yes, there is a danger. We want to ask our participants the same questions throughout our study process. And here's how you're going to do that. So, we're going to choose from one of two modes. We're going to do structured interviews, which means we're going to create 8 to 10 questions. We're going to ask those questions and nothing else. Or we can do semi structured interviews where we ask 8 to 10 questions and we might follow up, just like David is doing in this conversation here today. And so you have those two options. The key is that when you write your chapter 3, when you're outlining your methodology, you're being very clear. We're going to ask follow up questions or we're not. You're also going to draft those questions. Those go as an appendix at the back of your dissertation, and we're going to stick to those throughout. We're not going to change. We're not going to add. It's very important that you spend some time with those questions. You think through those questions to make sure that you've got all the key things. You might also engage in an expert review, somebody who is not going to be interviewed, but would otherwise meet the criteria, and have them look at your questions and see what else might be missing, what nuances you might need to capture through additional questions. Those are acceptable methods. We want to do all of that, get it locked in before we start our interviews. The other key element of this is your IRB review. Your IRB panel is going to want to see those questions. And if you deviate from those questions after you receive IRB approval, your study is no longer approved. And you will need to go through that whole process again. So be very thorough, very careful before you go to IRB. Once we're out of IRB, we don't make any changes.
Definitely great advice there. And as Matthew said, get your interview protocol, your questions set before. Even if you're doing semi-structured questions, you should have 8 to 10 base questions that every participant is answering. That's going to be really important for making sure you collect the data you need. It's only when there's follow-up questions in a semi-structured interview that you might ask slightly different questions, but I also tend to try and prepare those questions beforehand as well and include them in my interview protocol to ensure that I am sticking to what I said I would do and I'm not getting in the way of IRB, because that can put you back months in some institutions because you have to wait for the next meeting. And if they happen to be only meeting in 3 months' time, you've just got to sit and twiddle your thumbs in the interim.